is that, for a long time, Japan had no incentive to export its culture. It was doing all it could to modernize throughout the early to mid 20th century, and then suddenly they found that folks over here in America were actually importing their stuff, and they said, "Oh, hey, sure, great, do whatever you want." But it's like there's really no reason for a long time.
I mean, it was only perceived as, in fact, in many areas, I think, in Japan, and in the boardrooms, in the very senior echelons of business and of politics, they now recognize that Cool Japan is an export brand, but they're just not entirely sure why. Because most of that level of Japanese society, if it wants to engage with the internet, gets its secretary to do it. Or its assistant. Very few extremely senior people in Japanese companies are very, very internet savvy. I know, because I had a conversation with a very, very senior diplomat not so long ago who told me blithely that there was no piracy in England. He hadn't been able to find any video piracy in England at all. And I said, okay, and gave him a little list of websites and said, didn't you look on the web? And he said, well, no, my kids use the web, but why would I use it? And because, in a way, Japanese pop culture has happened since the spread of cheap or free broadband for the West. And before that, Japan also didn't have that many means of accessing. Before the internet, Japan didn't have that many means of accessing how other people were responding to its culture. And so most Japanese didn't know. But now we're at a stage where the average 13-year-old with a broadband connection in Tokyo could probably give senior Japanese politicians a pretty good briefing on how things are going down for Japanese popular culture in the West.
Absolutely. Well, always, ask a 13-year-old. They're the ones who know everything.
Oh, yeah. And also, of course, they're the ones that are alert and interested and getting involved, just as Tezuka himself was, in overseas culture. I mean, when you're a kid, most kids tend not to be fearfully conservative. Unless they've been brought up, that way and scared badly. Most kids are just, where is it? It's interesting. Bring it on. I like it or I don't like it, but I'll look at it and then I'll tell you what I think. And Tezuka was doing that right through his life. He was gobbling up, as a child, translated Western literature, film, all sorts of film from Europe, from America, from Japan, magazines. His father would bring home magazines and they would have translations of articles from the West or articles about the West, and he would just consume those. He was crazy about Russian literature. He was crazy about science fiction. And I think Japanese kids today are the same. They're crazy about all these new bands. They're passionate about all these new games and brands. They really want to see what's going down. And in just the same way, of course, Western kids are looking at Japanese culture and saying, yeah, I love that, give me that. Looking at Asian culture in general and saying, wow, fantastic. So while teenagers have got access to all of this stuff, there's going to be a continuity of interest between them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and a lot of the kids I talk to, talk about how they're not interested in sort of the American overculture, even the sort of teenage overculture of, the Gap or superhero comics or whatever it should happen to be for that age range. And they see this Japanese stuff, and it's just so different in a very fundamental way. It's still telling human stories, but it's coming from a different perspective that is perfect for those teenagers who are looking for always something new.
Yeah, and also, of course, it is fundamentally much younger.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if in looking at current Western comics, there are some very, very good young artists, but the majority of the big sellers are made by guys in their 20s, in their 30s, women in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. The majority of the big names are well into middle age. The turnover, it's easier perhaps than it was for kids to break into comics. But the impetus that you had when they were setting up the bullpen at Marvel in those post-war years, the energy isn't there.
Yeah.
And, people are seriously talking about should comics be a postgraduate occupation, which I find very strange indeed. Whereas in Japan, you've got kids going to their local fanzine meets, and there are fanzine meets, and there are doujinshi sales all over Japan. And if you can get access to a photocopy or a printer, you can put your work out there. It doesn't matter if you're 12 years old, 13 years old, 14 years old. You can compete on equal terms in that the only judgment anybody will make is, what do I think of this book?
Yeah. Nobody's
going to say she's a 13-year-old schoolgirl, he's a 15-year-old kid. All they're saying is, what do I think of this book?
Exactly. And I was amazed looking at the numbers that came out recently. I forget the name of the Japanese company, but doujinshi is, I think, a $1.2 billion industry this year.
Oh, yeah.
And, I knew it was
pretty
big,
amazing.
But it's huge. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
And I think because we don't have that support system, because we don't have that in Britain and we don't have that in the States, we don't have that grassroots get out to a small fanzine market and sell 25 copies of your book. We don't have that fierce, passionate, in some ways very tough market that Japanese artists come through.
Absolutely. I think it's one of the reasons why the Japanese anime companies and manga companies have been very careful about not squashing that market and not enforcing those copyrights and so forth, and saying, hey, you want to make doujinshi, go ahead, because that really is the foundation of their industry in a lot of ways.
Oh, absolutely. And also, of course, a doujinshi circle is usually making a very different kind of product than many American fan artists that you see at conventions. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love the artist alleys at conventions because I love to see people creating.
Sure.
But an awful lot of the things you see on artist stalls are not people making their own comics. They're people doing prints of one character from a particular show that they then sell.
Yeah.
So apart from the talent to render the image, the creative input in there is zero. Whereas in a doujin circle, you're making a whole story. You're doing maybe 5, 10, 15, if you're doing the whole book, maybe 60 or 100 pages of narrative art. So not only do you have to draw the character in ways that you may never have perceived them in the anime or the manga, but you also have to invent the story and you have to invent the backdrop. So I think you can't really say that allowing doujinshi artists to go ahead should also give permission to people who just want to rip off t-shirts or rip off prints, because it's a whole different creative level.
Yeah.
And again, I always say to young artists, I think it's great that you copy the artists you love to get your own voice, to get a handle on your style and to improve your technique. That's how artists have honed their techniques for thousands of years, probably since the first guy drew a mammoth on a cave and the other guy sitting there thought, like the way he's done that pelt. Let's just copy that and see how he did it. That's how artists learn. That's how artists grow. But at some stage you have to stop copying and find your own voice. And I would just love to see artist alleys deluged with prints of great individual characters that people have designed themselves. But sadly, while you can sell, I don't know, $200 worth of prints in a weekend of the favorite character from the latest game, I suppose for a lot of people there's not a great temptation.
Yeah, it's frustrating. The funny thing is, anyone who can see this on video when it goes out, I have a bunch of pieces of art from various artist alley on the wall behind me, and inevitably the one that gets the most comments is this pink-haired girl who's just standing there, and as far as we can tell, she's a completely original character. And I love the print. I bought it. I was like, that's great. And that's the one that almost everyone that gets the most comments compared to all the others. And it's like, hey, folks, do more of this.
Yeah. Now, I think you could say that the Japanese companies are missing a trick here in not making it much easier to buy legitimate merchandise. But, of course, the other thing is that an individual seller who's just looking to make his or her convention money, plus a bit to spend, can always undercut a licensed seller. Always, there's just no competition in that market, and so I understand why people do it. I just think it's sad because, as you say, when you see somebody's own true, authentic creativity come out, that's a thrill. That's much more thrilling than if I want a Gundam robot. I can go and buy a Gundam robot done by Yaz. I don't need one done by some unknown kid in the States.
Yeah.
I can get a manga character done by the manga artist. I can buy that in books. I can buy that in posters. Yeah. I'll much rather go to an artist alley and, like you, see an original character and say, wow, that really speaks to me. I want to spend my money on that.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it just speaks to, I have the same reaction to folks who write fanfic, where, it's great. That is how a lot of writers get their start and sort of figure out how to structure a story and so forth. But at some point you need to graduate to your original characters and your original story. Otherwise, you're very constrained.
Yeah. And while it's true that some people have actually managed to make a career based on writing fanfic, it's been in very specific circumstances. I mean, for example, in the early years of Star Trek fandom, a lot of the fans who wrote fanzines and shared fanzines in the States were picked up by Paramount and added to the writers' roster for their official novels.
Right.
There was a girl who did Xena fanfic online who was actually picked up by the company that made Xena Warrior Princess and given a script to do. In Britain, a great many Doctor Who fanboys have graduated to writing Doctor Who scripts through, mad enthusiasm and doing lots of fanfic. But it's not as guaranteed a way. There are no guaranteed ways in, obviously, but it's not as guaranteed a way in as proving that you're a good writer first.
Yeah.
I mean, I know several writers who've never done fanfic in their lives, but have been picked up to write licensed spin-off fiction because they're just good writers.
Yeah. I was listening to a podcast by some business guys actually talking about resumes or CVs and saying that, look, folks, stop trying to impress us with tricks. Tell us what you actually have done. Impress us with the quality of your work, and that's what's going to get you the interview, and that's ultimately what's going to get you the job. And I think that's true of so many things, particularly, art and story. Folks will be impressed by your story, not the fact that you're using Haruhi Suzumiya or what have you.
Yeah, and you can see that, in fact, in Tezuka's early career, because he got his break by a colossal piece of luck. I mean, the sort of luck that all writers and artists pray for.
Yeah.
A neighbor of his family at home in Takarazuka worked for a big publishing company in Japan that was bringing out a children's newspaper. And they wanted someone to do a comic strip, who was fast and cheap. And so she went and knocked on the Tezuka door and said, Mrs. Tezuka, I know your boy loves to draw, because Tezuka was known for loving to draw. Do you think he'd be interested in doing a comic strip for us? Well, would he be interested? Of course, he'd bit their hands off. And that was where he got his break at 17 years old. But that wasn't enough to make him a career. Yeah. What he had to do was be totally professional and totally reliable and deliver every day, day after day, on time to the right level of quality. And after doing that for 3 months, he was offered another strip, and another newspaper offered him a strip, and he began to get a certain amount of respect from professionals in the area who said, this kid's good. We can see his work, he's good. And then, of course, when he went to talk to publishers about longer stories, he actually had a folder full of clippings that said, I can turn out a daily, a weekly young-comma strip, and I can sell, I can get numbers. And that means so much. Nothing substitutes for actually just getting your work out there and keeping it up. And, again, like you, I'm sure I see a lot of kids who say, well, look, this is my character, and this is my universe, and I say, that's great, but why aren't you publishing?
Yeah.
Don't wait to get it right. Get it out. You can refine it all you want, but once you start putting it out there and getting people piling in and saying, we love this, or we hate this, or this sucks, or I think that's wonderful and this sucks, then you can start to refine your work, and then a prospective publisher can say, A, this person arouses a lot of controversy, but there are a lot of people saying they love their work. B, we can see that they've been publishing every day, every week for the past year. We can probably work with this person. They're behaving like a pro.
Absolutely. And I think that actually gets to one of the things that I always, I always appreciated about Tezuka's story, is I think there's this myth that Tezuka, sat down when he was 19 years old and came up with Astro Boy and just, published that and went on to great acclaim, but it was a much, much longer process and an evolution. Astro Boy just didn't spring full from Tezuka's head. He went through a lot of ideas and failures before he came up with his great successes.
Oh yeah, and he'd been making comics from a very, very early age. I mean, he did his first full-length comic when he was like 9 years old. And he kept all his notes, all his notebooks. Some of them were destroyed in the fire bombings, but we still have a lot of his juvenilia, and it's preserved by his family, and the Tezuka Museum at Takarazuka has some of it on show. But he kept those notebooks, and he mined those notebooks, and he was forever tinkering with ideas and revamping ideas and borrowing ideas. And of course, later on, that stood him in good stead, because when he was working flat out in the 50s and 60s with so much work coming in that he didn't really have a lot of time to be precious and say, oh my goodness me, I have writer's block. He could just grab a notebook and say, okay, where's a plot I haven't used? There's an idea. That might work. I'll put it with this. He had this kind of kit that he put together of his entire life of bits and pieces that he could string into a fast story. But if he hadn't had those years of practice before going pro, and then those years of practice as a pro building up to it, he would never have been able to sustain the pace that he worked at, because it was insane. I mean, and you're quite right that he was perceived for a long time, and I think in some quarters he is perceived now as being this phenomenon who sprang fully formed from the brow of Zeus and sat down and wrote Astro Boy in 25 minutes. And that just is so untrue and so much less fun and less interesting than the reality, which is that he read great comics, and he also read great literature and saw great movies and did other things apart from comics, which is very important if you're ever going to be any good as an artist or a writer. You have to go wide. You can't just go in one medium. But he'd done all that, and so when his opportunity came, he started small. His first work was a little 4-panel strip about a 5-year-old kid and his best friend hanging around in suburban Osaka, occupied Osaka, and comparing these big flashy eyes with their uniforms and their chocolate and their chewing gum with their shabby salaryman dads just going out to work every day. And it was all about kids coming to terms with the world around them. So it was something Tezuka could remember. It was something kids could relate to. It was something parents could smile at. It was universal. And it was really, really simple. And he kept it that simple and pure and beautiful till he knew what he was doing and was worked into the groove. And his first long-form work actually was a collaboration. Because even though he was this, hot kid that everybody was talking about, nobody was going to take a risk on him to helm an entire book, write and illustrate it all on his own. That's quite serious money, even in a cheap medium. So he teamed up with a guy from the local comics society who wrote New Treasure Island. And Tezuka drew New Treasure Island, and there was quite a lot of conflict between him and his older collaborator, because Tezuka wanted it to be about 100 pages longer than it ended up, and Mizu cut it back radically. So Tezuka again had to learn how to adjust to the demands of the market. But maybe it was that experience that gave him the tendency he had for the rest of his life to go back and tinker with things. In new editions, he could never resist redrawing them, adding bits, changing bits, So it makes it quite difficult to find the definitive edition of the great Tezuka works, because almost every time they were reprinted, he'd do something different with them. But he had all that experience and all that practice long before 1951, when he introduced Astro Boy as a supporting character in another comic. So there's a long genesis there before you actually get to the thing he's best known for. But it wasn't a long genesis that wasn't exciting, and one of the fun things about now is that we are starting to see some of Tezuka's early work come out in English. I think they're out of print now, but I think you can still get them if you look around. Metropolis, Lost World, some of the great early manga are out there, and Metropolis, of course, is a wonderful, wonderful manga.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I love about Lost World is that it's the point at which manga invents moe.
You think so? That's interesting.
Yeah, 1948, Tezuka defines moe. So you have these two girls who are actually created from plants, genetically engineered by a rather nasty, slimy scientist who is one of these guys with hands everywhere and who has every intention of exploiting these two poor girls as much as possible. And Lost World is quite a bloody book. Most of the characters die in it. And there's a great deal of political chicanery, and Donald Duck, trust me, Donald Duck is very nasty indeed. And yes, it is Donald Duck. No, not Donald Duck, sorry, Popeye the Sailor Man. You'll have to either edit that or make me look a total idiot, but never mind. But the characters of the girls are quite vague and undefined, and they are very much sheltered flowers, literary flowers, because they're genetically engineered from plant material. And when one of them dies, the other one forms a huge crush on the hot young scientist who's leading the party. But not the sort of crush that young girls would be expected to form today. She thinks of him as an older brother. And when one of the other guys tries to act inappropriately, and the young scientist tells him very firmly to stop, our heroine looks at him and thinks, if only I had a brother like Kenichi-san, it would be wonderful.
Interesting.
So there you've got the whole thing, the sweet innocent girl looking up at her big brother and depending on him, and the guy stepping in to defend and guide and guard her. And if that's not moe, I don't know what is.
Absolutely. So getting back to that question,